Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward. Welcome to APTN National News. We start our special coverage of this first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation in Ottawa, where about 1,000 people gathered on Parliament Hill. Brett Forrester has that story.
It was a sea of orange outside the halls of power. More than 1,000 filled the streets in the nation's capital, while ceremony, language, songs, and culture filled the air. It was a day to remember the kids whose voices were silenced, to honor the survivors who made it home, and demand justice for those who never had any.
From the moment those little ones went into the ground, they were speaking in spirit. And they knew that to come a day that we would all hear their voices.
Politicians looked on as elders and survivors addressed the crowd before leading a somber march that wound through the streets to Confederation Park. Last night, Centre Block's Peace Tower was turned orange. In front, a ceremony attended by Prime Minister Trudeau, whose speech was done behind a collection of empty shoes and teddy bears.
It's harder to reflect on the truth. Of the mistakes, of the evil that we did in the past. But that's what this day of truth and reconciliation must be.
Governor General Murray Sinclair taped an address to the country, partly done in her first language, Inuktitut. Brett Forrester, APTN National News, Ottawa.
We head to Montreal now, where hundreds took to the streets. For many, the day is not only to remember, but a call to action. Tom Fenario brings us the story.
It means many things to many people. For some, it is a way to honor survivors of the residential school system.
My grandma went to residential school.
For others, it's a day to grieve those who never came home, with a moment of silence.
If you all would join me and just think good thoughts for them, so that their souls and spirits may be at peace.
But for most here, the day is about action. Or for Alan Gull of the James Bay Cree, specifically, the lack of it.
It's sad to say that, I'm a First Nations person from Quebec because, our provincial government doesn't even recognize the day as a holiday.
Kanien'kehá:ka activist Ellen Gabriel took the occasion to call for all Canadians to act.
We need you to push your educators, to push your government, to push your elected leaders to make the changes that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission talked about.
And for these families of residential school survivors, there was perhaps the most important act of all. That of defying the system that once tried to kill their culture by passing it on to their children.
Orange Shirt Day is about the kids that never went home.
Tom Fenario, APTN National News, Joe Jage, also known as Montreal.
Just incredible turnouts everywhere. It was a massive crowd that gathered in Winnipeg at St. John's Park today, marching on this National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. Michelle Karlinzig was on the ground after the march.
It's a sea of orange behind me today at St. John's Park in Winnipeg. Thousands of people have come out to honor National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. The march started at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights and made its way down Main Street and in here at the park. Leading that march was a young man named Tatum. He was marching for his grandfather, who is a residential school survivor. Lots of people still coming into the park today. It's quite incredible just how many people are here. One gentleman that I spoke with said that this was the biggest crowd he had ever seen for Indigenous people since the Tina Fontaine marches. Lots of stories from survivors today, and we'll have some of those stories for you tomorrow at 5. I'm Michelle Karlenzig, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
Thanks, Michelle. Of course, the new National Day is being honored across the north as well. And in Whitehorse, people gather to reflect on the legacy of residential schools. Our reporter Sarah Connors was there.
Today, hundreds of people gathered in downtown Whitehorse to honor residential school survivors and their families.
The hurt that many of us have been living for lifetimes was brought back to surface this year.
There were a handful of events, including this drum procession led by the Warrior Walkers for Healing Nations. The procession then marched to this healing totem pole at the Whitehorse Riverfront, where Chief Steve Smith of the Champagne-Ajiac First Nations led a prayer song. Other events included gathering around a sacred fire at the Quanlan Dunn Cultural Centre. Councillor Jesse Dawson said today is a day to honour truth and build a path forward towards reconciliation.
Despite what we have endured, I see a bright future. I invite you all to see that bright future too.
Sarah Connors, APTN National News, Whitehorse.
In other news, the Métis National Council held an election today, one that made history for the MNC. For the first time in 18 years, the Métis National Council has a new president. And for the first time, MNC has elected a woman as its president. 3 candidates had put their name forward to replace Clémente Chartier as the president of MNC. It took 3 ballots to determine a winner. Cassidy Caron, a former provincial youth minister with the Métis Nation of British Columbia, who now lives in Ontario, was elected on that 3rd ballot. Caron's presidency comes just days after the Manitoba Métis Federation announced it was leaving the MNC over membership issues with the Métis Nation of Ontario.
Yesterday, we turned a new page. And today, we begin a new era, one of accountability, of transparency, and of governing on behalf of the entire Métis Nation.
You can find more on that story over on our website, aptnnews.ca. Well, we have much more coverage of this day for truth and reconciliation still to come. Stick around. Welcome back. Queen's University Chancellor Murray Sinclair is a former senator and chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. He joined Melissa Ridgeon for a one-on-one discussion about what today means to both Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. Here's part of their conversation.
You know, a lot of people are using the term genocide now more than probably in the past. And again, is it because of the graves? You know, what do you make of the stronger language that people have about Canada's history?
Well, genocide was an often misused and misunderstood concept over the many years since the Second World War, particularly, because we always equate the concept of genocide with the Holocaust. And the Holocaust was about murdering people and putting people to death in gas chambers and doing violence to them. And that indeed is sincerely important to recognize form of genocide, and we can't ignore it. But genocide also includes any action that is deliberately intended to eliminate a race of people. And that can be a physical action of destruction. It can be things like preventing women from having babies, for example. So the idea of eugenics, for example, is about an act of genocide. preventing mothers from being able to raise their own children in their own culture is an act of genocide. So taking children away and placing them into non-Indigenous foster homes or foster care or institutions like residential schools is an act of genocide. And deliberately starving people, like the government of Canada did for a significant period of time. We suspect that we will discover, if we did a proper investigation of the reason children died in residential schools, we suspect that we will find that they were underfed, malnourished, and may have starved to death because of the way the schools were prevented from being able to feed them properly. We talked to people who worked in the schools, and they all tell us to a person that they were deliberately given short budgets to buy food for the kids. So that's why they had gardens, and that's why they had farms on residential schools, was so they could grow their own food supplies. But not all schools could do that. And a kid doesn't have to die of starvation to be impacted by food policy like that. They could be so weakened by the act of starvation or the process of poor food that they will simply not be able to fight any kind of disease or any kind of illness that they encounter.
What does justice and accountability look like for those survivors and for those children that didn't come home?
Well, first of all, I think it's awareness and acceptance on the part of the Canadian people that this, in fact, happened is part of that process. There are many who say that we'll never have justice until those who perpetrated the acts are brought to justice, or prosecuted and imprisoned, or something is done to them.
Do you think that will happen?
Well, the problem we have with that is that most of the people who committed these acts of misdeed are passed on. Yeah. And many of them will probably be in their 80s and 90s. And while we can lock somebody up in their 80s and 90s, what impact is that really going to have upon their lives? They will die in public institutions. But I think more importantly, the real question is, are we really going to feel a sense of justice if we work hard to perpetrate some form of violence against the perpetrators, when we now have an opportunity to come to terms with establishing a relationship of peaceful coexistence? If we can do that, then I think we should really focus our minds on doing that.
Is there anything else that you wanted to say on this day?
You know, I get asked that a lot by interviewers, and I'm always at a loss as to what to say, but I want people to know that September 30th is a day that we're going to stumble along initially to figure out what to do with it. We may not get it right initially the first few times, but I think we will learn from our experience, and I think that we should not give up on ensuring that our days of honoring those who are involved in residential schools and our acknowledgement of the nature of the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in this country has come to an end, must come to an end, and that we will recommit on September 30th to having a better relationship with each other. It's like renewing our vow that we put into the treaties.
We head now to Kamloops Disaquatmuk and the former Kamloops residential school. That's where our reporter Tina House was today.
It's the dawn of a new day as Canadians honor the first Truth and Reconciliation Day a federal holiday to remember all those that attended residential schools. Here in Kamloops to Sequepum, this honor song and ceremony is performed near the location where the 215 unmarked graves were discovered just 4 months ago.
I'm thinking and praying for the young ones that went to this school, and also asking for them, your ancestors, to give us guidance and give us strength to continue the struggle that we're on today.
No longer silenced, it's a day to reflect the strong resiliency of Indigenous people that survived genocide. The horrific discovery of the 215 children have now led to more unmarked graves being discovered across Canada. Meanwhile, the search continues to finally unearth the painful truth of what really happened. For survivors like Rose Miller, who attended here in 1949, it's taken her years to finally find the courage to share her horrific memories.
Our peoples were so traumatized by this residential school, and a lot of our stories weren't heard before they were told, but we were never believed.
Cookbeat Chief Roseanne Casimir says there are only 15 documented deaths of children at the former residential school, but so far they have uncovered more than 215 unmarked graves here alone.
We believe this is one such situation of mass human rights violations, and we are concerned it might reflect criminal behavior, including suggesting violations of humanitarian law and genocide.
Lawyer Don Worm says that the handling of complete records is troubling.
It has the applications for all of those students that had applied for the Common Experience payments. What is most troubling about this is that there is now judicial approval for the destruction of those records. Where in a civilized country, where in the civilized world do documents get destroyed with judicial authority? Where?
These drums represent the heartbeat of a nation as we remember those that never made it home. Young, innocent lives that were cheated of their full potential. They were sons, daughters, nieces, nephews, and friends, and they were loved. Along with the survivors, today is their day to remember those that we lost and those that still survive. Tina House, APTN National News, to Kamloops to Sequepum.
Thanks, Tina. We've got much more to come. Stick around. Welcome back. Dozens of people joined a walk that covered 100 kilometers in southern Ontario to remember a son, a brother, and a friend who never made it home from residential school. APTN's Elena McDougall has that story.
That's Joey. His photograph is just the way he was, you know? He's a very handsome boy, very handsome boy.
The family of Rocky Commanda and the late Joe Commanda set out on August 25th to commemorate a journey decades ago that ended with only one brother returning home from residential school. Their sister Loretta organized a walk for Joe.
I thought of all the trauma that, you know, a sudden death and no family members around. So I said, we have to bring him home. We have to lay him to rest with the family.
Children who were forced to attend the Mohawk Institute sometimes followed train tracks to try and escape the school known as the Mush Hole due to brutal starvation conditions, and many tried to return to their communities. In September 1968, brothers Rocky and Joe Commanda set out on a 450-kilometer journey home. 50 kilometers out, older brother Rocky was apprehended by police, and Joey got away and continued. Doug George was a friend and protector of Joey at the Institute.
He was part of our group, and our group protected each other against a lot of the violence that took place at the school. And so we decided to parallel his journey because we couldn't walk on the train tracks last week. We followed as closely as we could on the hard surface streets.
Joe's siblings were determined to set their brother's spirit free. Approximately 100 people joined them on roads and highways through the cities of Brantford, Hamilton, Burlington, Oakville, and Mississauga to Toronto, where Joe Comanda's escape came to a tragic end.
He got hit by a train on number 3 track, right close to there. And that's the only safe spot we can get, close to the tracks.
The family has trouble discussing the tragedy, but for Doug George, he knows why Joey ran rather than return to the mush hole.
Joey's death was a direct result of the fear that he had that he would be victimized. And it's related to the conditions at that institute, brutality, the food deprivation, the sicknesses that took place there. And the police never investigated this as a criminal matter the way they should have.
A coroner's report found no fault with the train driver and no recommendations were made. Survivors of the Mohawk Institute have declared the site a crime scene ahead of the possible discovery of unmarked graves there. 53 years have passed without justice or healing for the Comanda family. This walk is the first in the process of bringing the children's spirits home from the Institute.
I felt that this sickness in my stomach every time I thought about Joey or the residential school, that what could I have done to have saved Joey's life. But this weekend, at least we released him, and by releasing him, hopefully it'll release us.
Just before arriving at the tracks, a cooling rain came down as the walkers pressed on.
I feel relieved. There's something that was there all the while, but I think it's going to be gone now, because we did all this for him.
Brother Rocky Comanda felt relief.
I'm sure happy it's over with now. That's it. But it's all the hard feeling I can say. But I'm glad it's over with.
A ceremony and feast took place in Pikwakanagan. Family and friends are hopeful that the walk will result in increased federal consultation with survivors as more children are recovered and brought home. Elena McDougall, APTN National News, Brantford.
What a story and what a day. APTN will continue to have special coverage all through the night to mark this National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. You can also find more on this special day and other news over on our website, aptnnews.ca. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for joining us. Tuli Anfin, Kish Chit A Takashu. Have a great night.